Right, hey guys, how we doing? Back another video from Totally Not Mark, and today we are checking out his review of Mob Psycho 100 Season 2. His review of Season 1 I really enjoyed, really good look at it, and in my personal opinion, Season 2 is better than Season 1. I think Season 2 is the best season out of the three. Not to say that either Season 1 or Season 3 is bad, but I think Season 2 is just like, didn't this have the guy that could teleport, and that scene where they're fighting? Oh, incredible. So, let's get into Totally Not Mark's review of Season 2 of Mob Psycho 100. Shabby!
Last week, I watched and reviewed Season 1 of Mob Psycho
Yep.
100, and it was epic. Way better than I ever thought it was going to be, and if you haven't seen it, you can click the link in the top
Such a
right.
good
but
season.
Season 2 is honestly better in almost
Ah,
every
sweet, he
way, and I
agrees
didn't
as
even
well.
think
Cool.
that was possible. This season had me on the edge of my seat and even had moments that made me cry, and it's been a little bit since that happened. So, without further ado, I'm Totally Not Mark, and this is
That's him, isn't it? That's the guy.
my review of the frankly
Ah, yeah, that's the teleport guy.
impossibly brilliant Mob Psycho 100 Season 2.
Let's do it.
Episode 1. I just, I love this episode, guys. Like, I mean, really, really loved it. Something that I think is often lost when stories become more complicated, layered, and involve numerous characters is the simple heart at the core of a very particular set of ideas, and in this case, episode. I pointed this out before, but one, the author of this story I'm reviewing, has the ability to write incredibly resonant and raw emotional scenes, the likes of which will not just take you off guard, but will leave you reeling and mulling over what you have just seen for days to come. This is such an episode, and honestly, episodes like this don't come around every day. In the case of One Punch Man's Moomin Rider versus the Deep Sea King scene,
Oh, mate, what a scene.
the character is presented as a joke in all of the episodes that featured prior. Someone delusional or perhaps propelled by ego into dangerous situations within which he has no chance of survival. One paints him with this brush because he wants to shine a light on not just who he is, but the greater message of the series at hand. In the world of One Punch Man, the conflict of interest that exists within Hero Society has created boastful, egocentric, or simply misguided heroes, the likes of which have lost sight of what makes a hero, well, a hero. And
yeah.
as Moomin Rider comically cycles to the scene of the greatest threat we've yet seen in the series up until this point, we anticipate failure in spectacular fashion, brought about by perhaps, as I said, his own ego or boastful nature. And while our expectations for the conclusion to this interaction were correct, with him losing in spectacularly one-sided fashion, the feeling it left us with was decidedly unexpected. For when no one else could, for the cowering crowd of men, women, and little children, if only to buy them a moment of reassurance, Moomin Rider stepped up to the plate, without hesitation, stared death in the eye, and dared him to blink.
He was a hero.
And in the end, while not achieving much of a result, without that initial sacrifice from Moomin Rider, Saitama, the person who does eventually save the day,
Wouldn't have been there in
might not
time.
have had the time to arrive on the scene. So in that instance, wanting to do the right thing saved countless lives. It highlighted what was, in this society, the making of a true hero, and Saitama recognizes this.
And then just boom.
The opening episode of Mob Psycho's second season plays on a similar expectation from its audience, however reverses the perspective of a few elements. Though the same shock and awe emotional effect is achieved, I think, perhaps even more effectively than the last in my estimation because it's more relatable. Love is a topic often left unexplored in a lot of these stories that I've read personally, but when it is attempted, it becomes the topic of my fascination. Because in these stories that so often deal with a coming of age, love is one of the most crucial pillars to get right in that narrative. And I think Mob, while not necessarily dealing with love directly in this episode, did deal with the broader concept of relationships. The heartbreak found in them, the fear, the nerves, and ultimately the betrayal. All linking back to the core foundations of this series, and indeed the character of Mob himself, choosing instead to be kind in the face of everything horrible everyone has done toward him unjustly.
Mob's just such a nice guy, man. Like I love him so much. He's an inspiration.
The basic outline of this episode sees a young girl ask out Mob after he embarrasses himself on stage in front of his school. Mob feels taken off guard, but eventually starts to feel good about it and, well, himself. Clumsy as he is through this area of his life, she shares with him parts of herself through her writing, and then she breaks up with him, citing that everything that happened between them was just a dare that she had to accept, and ultimately it was a joke. I think anyone of any gender or denomination can feel the hurt for Mob in this instance.
Definitely, it's such a betrayal. It's like you feel like you've got it all, and then it's haha, it's a joke. You'd be so hurt.
And that universally felt sense of hurt is exactly what makes this scene and his actions that follow so seismically powerful. In creating a character like Mob, who is scared of most things conventional and certainly isn't skilled in any of the adjacent areas, one also created the perfect character to be brave.
やめ
Oh yeah, he sticks up for her, doesn't he? Yeah.
頑張って書いた小説を破くなんてひどいよ
Then he fixes
This gave me chills, and honestly, I got goosebumps just talking about it. And for a story that is rooted in the fantastical and the grand, this small moment shared between two people is the most my soul has enjoyed this series. With Mob not just stepping outside of his comfort zone, but also opening up to show a piece of his authentic self to someone who moments earlier rejected and embarrassed him. That, my friends, is another hero. The musical track composed for Mob fixing Emmy's book, aptly titled Mob's Kindness,
All right.
is so incredibly wonderful. The track starts with glockenspiel, recorder, and kalimba at the forefront. All instruments that are wonderfully sweet and generally pretty simple. All instruments that could be played by children. It really gets across this sense of childlike sweetness and wonder, meekness and compassion that Mob demonstrates. Then, as Mob decides to use his psychic abilities in front of Emmy to help her, the chorus of strings come in an absolutely beautiful crescendo of radiance and emotion. This track, paired with the awesome storyboard and the absolutely astoundingly sensational animation, really goes a long way in selling what a sweet and genuine soul Mob is. With his kindness and meekness no longer seen as faults, but instead, assets.
He's such a G. Is that the phrase? A G? Dude, not many people would, like, after being told what they've been told by her, would go back and do that. Genuine, nice guy.
Episode 2 and 3. When it comes to animation for this season, the level of quality is evident for all to see. Returning to lead the series, we find Tachikawa and Kameda as the character designer. However, this time Kameda has taken on the role of Chief Animation Supervisor. What is Chief Animation Supervisor?
That's
I
a
hear
title
many
and
of
a
you
half,
asking.
that.
Well, unlike a regular animation supervisor who leads the animation direction in an individual episode, a Chief Animation Supervisor provides those corrections across every single episode.
I love how he's doing the boo 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 every time.
Across the season. It's very demanding stuff, and for this reason, it's a role Kameda didn't want to take in season 1, fearing it might compromise his ability to do his own episodes. However, it doesn't seem to have affected much as he handles episode 2 himself uncompromised.
Nice.
And my long-winded talk about episode 1 aside, what I'm trying to get across is that while last season dealt with a lot of exploring what Mob's power meant to him and others, this season focuses a lot more on, honestly, a much more interesting aspect to the series: the inner development of Mob himself,
yeah.
through the flings he shares, the conflicts of interest he encounters, and the existential crises that manifest before and all around the young man. If nothing else, this story about a young, gifted individual in middle school tells the tale of pretty much every single one of us. These years were a transformative time in our lives where we take the first real steps to becoming the people we're going to be for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
And knowing this, the author one leverages the fantastical elements of his world to explore the very volatile part but mundane aspects of our lives in ways that amplify it for us all to take notice and understand. And while I enjoyed what this episode opened us up to with regards characters and world building by introducing us to a new friendly, it was episode 3's focus on the inner conflict and development of Mob that really captured my interest. All in all, the episode deals with what is, for all intents and purposes, a regular few days as an employee of Reagan after he sets up his hilariously terrible website. In the first season, by and large, there wasn't a huge focus on complex enemies with complicated motivations in the spirit world.
No,
At least
true.
not in the same way that this episode contends with. Early on, after apprehending a stalker that manipulated his spirit-wielding powers, it becomes apparent to Reagan that Mob has changed or is changing, voicing his opinions openly, questioning various aspects of his job and his actions in an ethical light. It's great seeing Reagan act as this father figure to Mob, perceptive to his feelings and his needs, but it's the ending that presents Mob with a dilemma the likes of which he'd never contended with before.
やめてください 私たち3人は家族なんです
In this episode, it's the human characters that are shown instead as reprehensible alongside
Yeah,
the spirits
instead
who
of the
just want
spirits,
to live
yeah.
a peaceful existence. Quote, "I'm not forcing you. It's okay to listen to your feelings," Reagan says to Mob. And it's this conflict of interest, this sudden shift in perspective that cuts to Mob's core as a character. It's a brilliant episode and one that Reagan wholeheartedly sides with Mob on because he's always got his back. And I
Yeah, he's
kinda
backing
love
up no
that.
matter what.
However, the closing sentiments of this episode speak to the possibilities that might lie ahead of Mob himself if things don't go well. For he fears that if he did go rogue or did the wrong thing, there'd be no one who could stop him. That no matter what way he looks at the world, no matter how bad he is at leading or taking charge or making decisions, the buck stops at him because ultimately he's the only one with the power to make that difference. It's a very sobering thought indeed for the episode to close on, and one that leads us perfectly into episodes 4 and 5. Similarly in structure to the first season, episodes 4 and 5 play host to the first multi-episode story that concerns our heroes, with the first 3 acting as sort of standalone tales that reinforce the themes we'll be talking about henceforth. Episodes 4 and 5 contend with really what is an interesting but straightforward premise. A rich guy gathers every psychic he can to help his daughter out of some sort of possession
yeah.
through exorcism or something. And I was really excited to see what sort of story would manifest from such a simple premise, and I wasn't disappointed. Firstly, on a music front, the track titled Release or Restraint that plays in episode 4 around the 9-minute mark is compositionally and contextually pretty interesting, but moreover acts as the musical representation of the scene at hand.
I love how he goes into actually discussing the music and how it plays and the composition and and all that. Because a lot of people that do reviews don't tend to go so far into the music. I mean, Giguk, when he did his anime in 2022, when he was talking about Made in Abyss and a couple of others, he talked about the soundtracks, and I think music's a very big part of getting emotional stuff across. Like when I used to make videos at university all those years ago, I was a big advocate for having the right track in the background and making it match up with what's going on the screen. Sometimes I try and have no dialogue and let the music explain what I'm trying to get across along with just what's on the screen. So yeah, music's a huge part, and I love that he's going into it.
It starts off as this genuinely creepy and unnerving piece as various timbres of piano play over a soft, sustaining synth. It very much does its job at giving us this creepy vibe of a mystery
creepy,
ghost that's
yeah.
possessing this young girl, but as the scene goes on and abruptly switches to the POV of the ghost itself and his boredom of dumb hack psychics, the music transitions to this off-kilter faux comedy music. A sloppily played trombone comes in over the top of the piano that is still playing from the earlier section, and purposefully offbeat drums are introduced. These weirder elements that are added give the POV shift this sense of everyone here is irrelevant compared to this ghost feel, while also maintaining a sense of creepiness and dread as the piano element from the beginning of the track remains at the core of the piece, just like the possessed girl remains the centerpiece of her scene despite being surrounded by irrelevant wannabe psychics. I love music stuff like that. It tells a story if you really pay attention, and it's honestly brilliant. After this, there's a nice character moment for Reagan, winning the rock, paper, scissors, but actually gets something out of the young girl that outs her as a demon possessing a host immediately, rather than beating around the bush with her lies and such. Amidst all of these fakes and legitimate psychics, up until Mob engages, Reagan is pretty much the only one to get anything of substance from the situation, with the only meaningful impact anyone else makes coming in the form of them acting as a host for the possessor to communicate to the greater group. I love how the author, makes Reagan so damn cool at every opportunity
He really does.
has. And
He's
even
absolutely
when he's
boss.
gotten the upper hand on, it's after landing an hilariously awesome E-strike of all things. We quickly learn that Mogami Keiji is a famed psychic of the 20th century and has possessed this little girl. Dimple has history with him but managed to escape, but that's sort of secondary. The real thing that I want to kind of focus on is that things get out of hand quickly.
Very
For the first
quickly.
time, Mob can't stop the bad things from happening at his will. He's not strong enough, or at least the gap between Mob and Keiji isn't so significant that Mob can gain the upper hand easily. Keiji beats up the crowd at will. Mob eventually steps in a more serious fashion, and all that exploration into Mob being more introspective and less meek translates nicely into him assessing the situation here and taking it seriously from the onset. He even uses techniques he learned from prior episodes in this season, like that which the Stalker in episode 3 used. This is awesome. Between Reagan, Mob's maturity, and even Dimple's fucking
Dimple
crazy
just-
heroics,
yeah.
this episode 4 is filled with brilliantly authentic character moments. When Mob eventually meets Keiji in a plane of existence that depicts them how they see themselves, it's interesting, to me at least, how Mob's form is depicted then. Keiji looks normal, as Mob says, but Mob himself seems, I don't know, a little exposed. And I think exposed is a great word here, perhaps indicative of the fact that he's not entirely comfortable exposing his powers and by extension himself in moments like this. A moment that quickly turns into a nightmare as Keiji casts Mob into an illusion, one where his powers no longer exist. If you thought I liked episode 4, episode 5 is a full-blown existential crisis that I've been thinking about since I first finished the episode. Placing our little hero in a world filled with hurt and depression, trying desperately to force Mob to grow resentful through a sense of injustice and powerlessness. This episode is a fever dream, or should I say nightmare,
Yeah,
with
it's
the
a
only
nightmare,
little
man.
tidbits
Jesus
that keep
Christ.
me hopeful are the pieces of dialogue Reagan offers during this madness when we get glimpses into the outside. He says, Mob is someone who can solve things on his own. He actually has strength, unlike me. To hear
He believes in him, man. Reagan's such a dude.
someone like Reagan say that, it's brilliant. I smile ear to ear hearing him say things like this. The way this nightmare is depicted is horrifyingly familiar and all too real. And honestly, it all feels kind of like a dreamscape or a nightmarescape depending on your persuasion. In the dreams we all experience, we often go through moments of intense realism only to suddenly shift and switch scenes without really noticing ourselves. All the way to extreme surreal visuals. And this particular illusion that Mob's in is no different. Out of everything that's been directed in the prior season and thus far in this one, this episode is the one that I think has the best combination of captivating boards that are married to the themes of what drives this story forward. Watching as Mob is robbed of every ray of light he's managed to cultivate in his life, all replaced with sorrow and hurt, is soul-crushing to see unfold. Worse again when this emotional and physical torture begins to manifest in a fashion that Keiji is looking for. Resentment, revenge, all of these horrible traits that Mob has actively made sure were not part of his life before suddenly come boiling to the top. Oi. Leave it to Dimple to remind Mob of who he is and how far
Yeah.
he's come. You couldn't get a better physical representation of what Mob offers a human being, or in this case, spirit, in this series.
Dimple's always there at the right time, man. And season 3, I can't wait for him to see.
The individual that has changed the most in this series, funnily enough, has been Dimple, and in this episode, it's emphasized that it's been through Mob's example. He was flattered that Mob would trust him with something as precious as his body in the first place, and interestingly, there's virtually no music in the first part of this episode, I noticed. And that has to be a 100% purposeful choice, as the lack of music really helps sell this sense of emptiness and
nothing's
isolation
there,
Mob
yeah.
experiences as he navigates the fictional world Keiji has created before him. Having come to his senses, Mob finally delivers perhaps the best line of the episode. The Shigeo you fabricated might succumb to you, but I won't. I'm not going to run. He's not the helpless, joyless, and friendless person Keiji wanted him to think
Do you think he was, yeah.
He knows he's more than that and can blaze his own trail, command his own destiny, and, moreover, because he's the one with the power that can stop him, he will. But to be honest, the episode is known for one thing, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it was only known for one thing only. I can talk about the story and the music all I want, but if I don't talk about the breathtaking animation on
Animation,
display that takes place
mate,
after here, I won't be
mate.
doing my job correctly. Episode 5 is unfathomably incredible. To the point of being enough to fill 30 minutes of video on its own. I mentioned Hakuyu Goen in Season 1's video for his incredible animation in Episode 11 and noted that he was a remarkably young prodigy, and since that first season up until this episode, he had worked on Episode 22 of Fate Apocrypha, boarding, directing, and leading the animation, resulting in one of the most astounding
Wow.
action episodes of anime maybe ever. It was an industry-wide event
It
upon
is
release,
sick,
with
like,
every
but-
animator and director under the sun talking about it. And that's important because he quite literally does it again here, and with arguably more nuance and finesse. The first half of the episode is introspective, and he opted to use a cinematic aspect ratio to create a feeling of otherworldliness, with a heaping load of layouts that emphasizes Mob's loneliness. We even get creepy looking angles like this dotted across the episode to allude or hint towards Keiji's ever-present watchful eye. Typically, an anime episode will have a production assistant credited, and part of their role is to assemble staff for an episode. In this episode, everyone was brought together through those connections exclusively, and as a result, there is no production assistant credit, which I think is kind of amazing. On the storyboard front, we have an incredible Toei affiliate in the form of Masami Mori,
Okay.
who many will know for One Piece. Here he draws the most ludicrous effects-driven sequence with insane fabric work.
It does look
He's pretty well
amazing,
known
right?
for his drawings of funny stick insect characters, which is plain to see in this other scene on the episode. And honestly, there are far too many animators to highlight in this first half alone. But if I had to highlight just one more, this specific highlight comes from Takuji Miyamoto. Someone mentioned briefly in season 1, but who really comes alive here. He's a student of Shinya Ohira, a legendary expressionist animator many will recognize from the Animatrix. And that very DNA can be
Oh.
found here in this insanely loose and rapping scene.
Wasn't there people involved with season 1 in the Animatrix, or am I making that up? I think the Animatrix has been mentioned a few times in a few like videos that I've watched recently. Like I think Giguk mentioned the Animatrix in like adapting stuff. Or was that? Oh god, no, it's Mother's Basement.
And all of this is amazing, but I haven't even gotten a chance to talk about the action in the second half. And so I'm going to leave the less action-packed stuff behind me for now because I fear that if I do not, I will be here all day. There's an endless number of all-star animators to talk about, okay? So let's go. Hakuya Go, I touched on him earlier, but in addition to everything he's already offered this episode, he also, somehow, found time to animate this insane sequence.
Whoa,
Keiichiro
yeah,
Watanabe
looks
is another
amazing.
huge name that's on this list, and he is such for his work on Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man recently. And here he goes wild with his effects drawing, creating such a horrifying depiction of these spirits, almost like warping bacteria. It all culminates with the introduction of Weilin Zhang, who animates just the most ludicrous display of effects. This guy is 17 years old. Okay, I'm grabbing my mic. I want to reiterate, he is 17 years
That's
old.
insane.
I don't even know what I was doing at 17. Imagine being this talented and you can't even buy alcohol. His work on Boruto
That's
is some of the finest action
mad.
ever brought to
Whoa.
screen. He just can't stop blowing minds wherever he appears. It then all
Okay.
wraps up with character animator extraordinaire Toshiyuki
That's
Sato,
insane.
putting together this goosebumps-inducing scene of Inori breaking down. He was also mentioned in season 1 for emulating one style at the end of the final episode, and yeah, there's just so much subtle brilliance to character acting that I love. Action animation is flashy by design, and by extension receives the lion's share of the praise going around online. But tremendous character animation, being able to capture the emotions of the moment so perfectly, requires a delicate but powerfully skilled touch, the likes of which only the very best of the best can achieve to this degree. And while that will largely do it for the names I'll drop in this episode, it cannot be overstated just how little this even begins to cover the insane, and I do mean insane, amount of talent on display in this episode. And interestingly, this was the first episode of this series to be made and was completed long before it aired due to Heyoku Go being required to leave Japan and head back to Taiwan for mandatory military service.
What?
Which sounds scary on its face, but apparently he treated it like a holiday. Which
No way.
maybe says more about the working conditions of the Japanese animation industry than anything else I could possibly say henceforth.
Huh.
Episode 6 and
Whoa.
7. This is a collection of episodes or mini arc unlike any other in this series I've seen, and because of that, I think this is up there as one of the single most important, or some might say best parts of the Mob Psycho 100 story. It's a pivotal turning point or culmination of where we start out our journey in season 1, episode 1, and moreover, made me cry like when my ex-girlfriend broke up with me, only in a happy way. Okay, that didn't make sense. But this arc definitely makes sense, and another thing that sets this one apart from all the other episodes is that Reagan is the primary character of focus. The main character of the story as we see how he came to be before he and Mob ever met. After a very brief flashback from where Reagan came from in his prior business, we flash forward to present day as Mob is being celebrated by his club for having gotten stronger. And I can see why. To be honest, 35 push-ups is a really solid effort for someone with no athletic ability originally.
I don't think I could do 35. I don't think I could do 10 right now. Jesus Christ.
Seeing him personally reflect on how far he's come and how it's been so long since he was in a friendly group setting like this is equal parts heartbreaking and inspirational. And that's really Mob Psycho in a nutshell. Then, it finally happens. Reagan calls Mob in the middle of a celebration of sorts, right before he had plans to go play karaoke with people. Reagan
Oh.
calls on short notice. And Mob says, for the first time, no to his request initially. And really, this all feels natural after the development Mob has undergone since the very first episode of the series, and the parallels are there to be seen for us to look at, especially now that we can contrast them. With this short notice stuff Reigen has been pulling normally working out great for him. However, this time, despite Mob showing up to bail him out just this once, it results afterwards in the conversation, or should I say, confrontation between the two. And let me tell you, it's as enthralling to watch as you might think. Reigen runs his mouth like he does best, trying to maintain priority in Mob's life for his business, but Mob biting back, if even faintly for the very first time, is more powerful than anything Reigen could lob at him. And
It was really good to see as well, because like you do get sometimes the feeling that maybe Reagan's taking advantage of Mob's kind nature, but sometimes the people pleaser's got to please himself.
when I first got to know these characters in Season 1, I was very interested in their dynamic. Theirs is very much a relationship forged on mutual benefit. Mob offers Reigen legitimacy to his business, and Reigen offers Mob someone to spend time with, a friend. However, as Mob grows as a person, what Reigen offers becomes less and less valuable. And that's what I understood after the first episode concluded, with Reigen himself acting as a force that pushes Mob away from things that directly align with his own self-interest, suggesting he not join a club in episode 2 in lieu of focusing all of his attention on his business. But if it was just that simple, I wouldn't be talking about it like I am right now. For Reigen has demonstrated more than once that while he is a con man, he does sincerely care
About Mob,
and
yeah.
his well-being, so there is a tremendous amount of nuance here. But what's interesting about this fact, and indeed these episodes in Season 2, is that every instance that Reigen helped Mob in this series, there could always be a metaphorical thread identified that linked that caring behavior to his own self-interest in some way, or at least in a neutral way at the very least. Why go save Mob in the hideout at the end of Season 1 and offer him life-changing responsible advice? Well, because he stands to benefit from Mob returning safely from this interaction. Why take Mob's side in the woods with those teens at the beginning of Season 2? Well, because it's bad for his business if Mob's heart isn't in it. Why help him in episode 4 and 5 of this season? Well, because he's incentivized to. Now, before I get comments saying that this is a very uncharitable way of looking at it, I agree, it is uncharitable. And I am, of course, not trying to suggest that he didn't want to help Mob simply because he cares about him either. But it's also important to understand that making these caring decisions towards Mob also happened to benefit him personally in the long run. And so, what makes these episodes, in my mind, so fascinating is that it is the very first time Reigen needs to make a 100% altruistic call. One that isn't beneficial to him or even neutral towards his business. In this moment, his advice to Mob should be, go spend time with your friends. But he doesn't say that. Instead, he doesn't focus on what Mob's best interests are. And the best part about this is that Mob notices.
Yeah, it's mad, isn't it? Like, oh, Mob starts clicking on stuff. And Reigen does, like, benefit every time Mob helps him. Yeah.
And so, after a few ill-measured words from Reigen towards Mob, a fissure between these two starts to form. And as time passes, Reigen is the one who feels isolated, not Mob. With this episode showing their respective realities side by side. On one side, Mob has decided to focus on his own personal development, and so he's
And Reigen's following
he's
around
sown
like,
there,
what's he
seeing
doing?
all the positive benefits, whereas Reigen just hasn't. It's here he actually realizes that outside of his job as a psychic, he doesn't really have much else to go on. And with a quick peek behind the curtain and a depressing email from his mom offering a window into this sort of existence, he is very much alone. And it's quite sad. Scenes where Mob is doing karaoke with his friends are contrasted harshly with Reigen slumming it in a familiar dive bar at the corner of nowhere. He thinks to himself that he doesn't have friends. The bartender didn't put alcohol in his drink, which is funny because it just reinforces the sort of spiral Reigen is on right now with his reactions as he stumbles and vomits his way out of that particular encounter. Thankfully though, this isn't an entirely sad story, and Reigen uses this moment of isolation as one of clarity instead, choosing to lift himself up and focus on doing what good he can, and by doing so, broadens the scope of his business, gains more fulfillment as a person, and funnily enough, gains wider popularity. This is what personal growth looks like, and eventually, he even gets invited onto television where a familiar guest plans his revenge on Reigen. I think from this episode, the main takeaway is that while being mutually beneficial and providing what the other needed, they also in a way shackled each other to a specific point in their lives, unable to move past that. Mob focusing his attention not on self-improvement and interpersonal relationships, but on Reigen and Reagan similarly not focusing on bettering himself or changing but staying the same, remaining in comfort. Which rings true to the overall message of Mob Psycho 100's story. If you want to better yourself and grow, you have to step outside of your comfort zone. Both parties in this instance have now done just that, and the results I think speak for themselves. But that doesn't mean that all of that personal growth doesn't unearth something else uncomfortable for Reagan to contend with.
いやー除霊も何もこの子取りつかれてないよね演技じゃん
You know when you're watching something really embarrassing happen to someone on stage live and it makes you feel immeasurably uncomfortable by
Yeah.
association? Well, this is the first time something like this has happened to me while watching an anime. This is a fictional character, and I'm fully aware of that, and I was feeling all sorts of ways when I was watching Reagan absolutely humiliate himself as this thing was
mate,
revealed
yeah, it was
that he was
dead
faking it all
cringy.
along. And this feeling for me happened because of how I feel about Reagan as a character and how he's been built up. A slick talker that can weasel his way out of any situation with his cunning. And seeing all of that bravado crumble around him for the world to see created an incredibly visceral reaction for me as a viewer. This, combined with the public
Wasn't fun
outrage
to
and
watch.
fallout, as well as his mother's increasingly concerning and intimate emails, it's a phenomenally effective way to immerse us in the circumstances of this character and the forces that are pulling him through the avenues he's pursued. He's trying so desperately to be something that he's not, and during a press conference that he holds, an essay he wrote as a student is exposed, titled, "I Want to Be Somebody." I think that says so much about Reagan's character. It cuts right to the core. As an audience, we know very little about his past, but the little we have garnered from him through the advice that he's offered Mob in the past, good or bad, paints him as someone that didn't attend any clubs after school or really had any meaningful relationships with people. And upon reflection of this, he remembers back to when he was at a crossroads, about to quit being a psychic altogether after just starting. And that's when Mob came in.
Yeah, Mob came into his life, yeah.
特別な何かになりたかった。俺はあれから何も変わっていない。あいつをただ利用してきただけ。結局、何にもなれなかった。
This is the moment Reagan recognizes exactly what he was doing to
Yeah.
Mob was bad. And in this moment of clarity, contends with correcting what he said to Mob straight to the camera without context. And upon doing so, the conference and the conflict he's facing, both internally and externally, extinguish in spectacular fashion. It's the lie the character holds to be true that once that lie is rectified and acknowledged, suddenly everything becomes much more simple. Only in the case of Mob Psycho 100, it's very visually and physically and literally taken care of
So
right before
good.
his eyes. And fittingly, this might be my favorite use of music in the entire season, personally. When the
Damn.
entire press conference erupts in psychic powers, it is meant at first viewing to be perplexing and a bit of a mystery as to what exactly is happening. I think it is really clever that for this scene, we get Mob's theme. Or at least we do sort of, with
Right,
one key
okay.
difference. The Sea Moon's instrument that leaves this
Right,
entire
yeah.
musical arrangement that we associate with Mob is nearly completely absent, but we can faintly hear it. With it not blaring its trademark creepy melody, I think it still manages to deliver this general sense of psychic powers that we have associated with the track, while also managing to suggest that while Mob is very much doing this, he's not close by any means. And that is, of course, suggested by the distant and faint sound of the Sea Moon instrument. And I think that's just super clever.
That's
Furthermore,
very
I also
cool,
think
yeah.
subconsciously it makes us think of Mob right before we see him and Reagan meet following this conference. Which brings me to the final scene of this mini-arc. The climax and culmination of everything these two have been through.
Bless.
Utterly
But
perfect.
bless.
It's moments like this that I personally live for in storytelling. It's why I read, watch, and listen to stories. The fantastical elements of this tale, while captivating and flashy, only act as the canvas for which this intensely emotional and personal story is shared upon. This is as much a story about psychics as The Lion King is a story about lions or The Shawshank Redemption is about prisons. If those were your takeaways from those films, then you have a very shallow interpretation of what those stories are actually about. Mob Psycho 100 is a story about personal growth,
Yeah.
friendship, and the expression of these human feelings outwardly. Of course, Mob always knew what Reagan was. Of course, Reagan felt like he needed to lie to Mob to be worthy of his time. And of course, Mob stuck around not for the snake oil Reagan was selling, but instead the shoulder he offered in earnest and the kindness that was so intrinsically part of what makes him, Reagan, a character. His insecurity and his business clouded his judgment, but true to Mob and who he is, he always has the ability to see things that others can't. In this case, he saw the genuine good person Reagan was, even when Reagan himself didn't see it.
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
think anything is more true to their dynamic, both literally and metaphorically, than that right there. This final scene of this episode is, for some, the emotional highlight of this entire series. And boy, does this insert song really help to sell the emotion of this scene. The insert song is entitled Grey, sung by Saju Nohana,
Saju
the singer
Nohana.
behind the OP. And it's actually not even the first time we've heard it this season. It was used in episode 1 of this very season at the very end, and I think
Oh.
it's understandable why. In both scenes, it was used to demonstrate the similarity in Mob's incredibly meek, kind spirit and growing emotional maturity. I think the way it is used in this episode in particular is especially fantastic. The way we are hit with the guitar harmonics as Mob tells Reagan he's a genuinely good guy crescendos into the
Bless.
following
So
montage
good.
of Reagan and Mob together, and that gives me chills just even writing about it right now. These are my favorite episodes so far. And honestly, it's not even close. We've gone on a wonderfully long and action-packed journey with these two characters. And this, for me,
Happy
this right here
birthday.
is the resolution to one of the most fundamental aspects of this season. A duo that was once held together by tenuous deceit and codependence now flourishes in a magnificent and lasting friendship built on the foundations of what kept it together partially in the first place.
Love it. And I'm going to grab a beer, so I think I can click this. I love that I can do that. That's so sick. 22.
All right, we're finally here, the final stretch of episodes, and it is distinct from all the others as it's the longest stretch of episodes that contain one mini arc or tell one solid
Like a continuous story,
Normally in
yeah.
the show, we're greeted with standalone
This is
episodes
so
or couples of
sick.
2 or even 4 sometimes at the end of season 1. But this, however, takes up almost half of the arc, and in doing so, delivers what I think has to be the main conclusion to most of Mob's personal development as a character, and really, it acts kind of like the climax of even season 1 and 2 combined. It screams final arc of the series, and yet season 3 somehow exists, which makes me even more curious about that, but I digress. This
Mate, season 3 is so important. It's not as good as season 2, but it's so important for finishing off Mob's like character and development, and it's such a good ending. But oh mate, yeah.
This was a thrilling and intense set of episodes, and fittingly, it kicks off quite the opposite, with an episode that wouldn't look out of place in a slice-of-life anime. Mob wants to place in the top 10 in his school's 5-kilometer race to impress his crush. With some of the highlights in this episode being Reagan taking time off of his work to help Mob with this race. It's wholesome. And on the day, at the starting line, he falls, scrapes his knee, and keeps running. Look, it's not pretty, but speaking as someone that sucked at almost every sport in school and then took up running long distance later, I loved this episode and what it kind of said about Mob as a character. The animation of Mob running towards the camera, losing ground only to regain it, is a brilliant way of depicting just how exhausting
He
and
is
mentally
trying
draining
so
running long
hard.
distances is concurrently. And despite
All right, Mark, show off you've run a marathon. I've run a marathon, haha.
not reaching
Actually, I think he's run more than one marathon, but okay, I've done it as well.
his goal, Mob improved enough such that he was on pace to make the top 70 or so. An enormous improvement on his 291st bottom 10 spot placing from last year. That is if he hadn't passed out. Now, I've never passed out while running, but the level of determination combined with the sheer amount of effort you would need to be exerting to make that happen in the first place, especially during a 5-kilometer race, I can only imagine. Mob is one really tough kid.
He
I
is.
can absolutely see what the Body Improvement Club sees in him. It's
so
inspirational.
cool.
But on that note, this is when the final section turns up the heat.
Oh, mate.
It's
There
a
we
tense
go.
and troubling event, but one Dimple can thankfully pull him back from. And while he does go full-blown Terminator on everyone until he finds answers, once he does realize that Reagan was a victim as well as all the neighboring psychics, he explains that Mob's parents weren't the ones burning in his home, which brings about the most human reaction from Mob I think I've ever seen in this story. Alright, so as many of you might have gathered during this moment in the story, Mob fainting is sort of a way for one, the author, to build tension before Mob awakening at some opportune moment later in the story. I love stuff like this, but it did make me think back to other parts of this story, and indeed other instances from one's other work, but I'll touch on that a little later. Effectively, this is the point in the story where all the allies and friendships Mob has built over the last 2 seasons
Culminates.
start to show what they're made of, and honestly,
Yeah.
some of my favorite character moments and scene writing is in here too. I don't want to go over absolutely everything that happens between now and Mob waking up, but I think the scramble to make
guy's
sure his
insane.
unconscious body is safe while he rests is hilarious, and at times
Isn't he blind as well? I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I watched it, but I'm sure he can teleport and he's blind.
a tense plot device. So let's talk about my 2 favorite moments while Suzuki Toshiro's goons introduce themselves to Teru and everyone gradually. Teru and the rest of the former Scars launch their offensive, all the while Reagan waits behind for Mob to wake up. He's been out cold for a while, and this is when intruders force their way into the building and force Reagan to hide with Mob still unconscious. This is perhaps one of the best callbacks to something I barely noticed or remembered from season 1. What an incredible save that only he could pull off. I was certain he and Mob were screwed in this instance.
Yeah, and then
he
Reagan just
even
pulls
manages
it
to
off.
take down the big guy. Uh-oh. Okay, so he wakes up, and the action that ensues with the primary focus being to protect Mob is one of the most infectiously exciting, humorous, and oddly tense scenes in the series. Particularly when Reagan drops Mob, that hulking massive steroid-fueled insecurity moves to crush him, and Dimple saves the day by
Yeah,
moving
he
into action.
does.
Possess Mom's body.
I wasn't expecting this again, and stuff like this, callbacks to prior events and implementations of already explained abilities are exactly the elements that make for terrific surprises and compelling action set pieces.
So sick. Like, and the way they work together. Dimple's a legend.
This is such a short but such a brilliant scene I just had to gush about here. Unfortunately though, Dimple's possession does come undone, and flying through the sky, Mob's unconscious body lands in the arms of none other than his gym bro bestie.
Hell yes.
Okay, look, I gotta call a spade here. I cannot deny that something like this happening isn't an astronomically unlikely event to occur,
But
and is
it's
sort of
sick to
contrived.
see.
What are the odds that they'd be the ones to catch him, even if their running route was disrupted? Probably next to impossible. So I have to take points away for that. But
The way these guys start fighting for him. Oh, mate. Go on, Dimple.
this is so fucking awesome.
Yeah, it
Okay. The best part is now that everyone has exhausted all of their energies and powers to stop this guy from causing undue harm to Mob, they've all proven themselves, and so we finally get what we've been waiting for.
Bob's awake.
Something
Take
I've noticed
that.
that the running trend with One Stories is that he orchestrates these grand scenes of struggle between forces of good and evil, but they only seem to exist in the first place either because Saitama or Mob are out of commission or too far away to be involved. It certainly creates anticipation, absolutely, because we're waiting for Mob to join the fight, but I've noticed that it seems to be one of the only aspects of One Stories that seems somewhat predictable to me. Heck, Dragon Ball Z did it with Goku and Namek, or
Yeah.
a bunch of other times. One Piece has done it with Luffy too. It's a popular shonen trope, but I think they made enough creative choices in between him falling asleep and waking up to justify this choice, in my opinion. This next episode is the first in a series of episodes in which we get to see how different Mob truly is. After all his socializing this season, and all the moments that forced him to mature, with him trying to explain the merits of all walks of life to the scarred runts, these moments really echo back to a similar feeling that we got with Reagan in Season 1. Except, despite all odds, I think it hits even harder now, because Reagan always, had that. I'm pretty sure he popped out of the womb confident and convicted, but Mob isn't
Probably.
that. We've watched him grow from a nervous, socially awkward kid who gets taken advantage of at every turn into a sweet, loving, meek person who has convictions in what he believes. Seeing him preach these values to others completely on his own, it just feels so incredible. Whether it be with these initial lackeys he encounters with the artificial psychic powers, this weird plant man, whether it be by the means of those he previously convinced or those he's currently entangled with in combat, Mob manages to deal with them as passively and with as little actual fighting as he can muster. And that's a wonderful touch, and something you really don't often see in climaxes of stories like this. And perfectly, as we transition from Mob, who manages to dispatch these folks without aggressive physical or psychic intervention, we're greeted with this incredible battle between Heru, the Ally Scars, and Ritsu, versus Shimazaki. The action sequence of all the different psychics trying to use their abilities combined with a very
So
expressive
sick.
and experimental storyboard make for some of the most compelling action animation I've seen this season. And what's more is, the seemingly untouchable Shimazaki does leave hits through if he doesn't detect them. Perhaps he can't keep track of it all. Either way, Teru notices this, and because of that, Shimazaki targets him.
あんたの動きも単調になるんだよ。能力に頼りすぎてる。
And
Cool.
once attack after attack after attack on Shimazaki is landed, he still stands, reaffirms control until
Here we go.
Mob makes his presence felt.
And then Reagan just goes in.
Did I mention that I would marry this show if I wasn't already married?
It's
One
so
look from Mob
good.
is enough to send this chicken running, but the best part of all is that while this fight between Sho and his father is happening above atop the tower, Mob starts to walk towards what is no doubt a dangerous situation alone. Unlike One Punch Man, where the drama comes from wondering if Saitama will or will not arrive on the scene on time, Mob can be hurt. And in more ways than one. He has fears, deep-rooted fears that
Yeah.
specifically this season of the show has explored. And due to this, I think that makes Toichiro the perfect and most worthwhile villain for Mob to face at the end of this season. And really, the entire series. He exhibits all of the negative traits Mob feared he might one day exhibit if he, someday, lost control.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
a big theme in this arc. Mob learning when it's okay to fight versus when it isn't. When it's okay to use your gifts versus when it's not. In
Oh, season 3. Oh.
Episode 1, he listened to his heart and used his powers to save something precious for another. In Episode 3, he was scared stiff when faced with the reality that he has the power to destroy innocent beings on a whim. And because of that, grew terrified of what he might become if he grew resentful or hateful. Who would stand in his way then? There would be no one to stop him. As a result, he grew untrusting of himself and his powers thereafter. The natural evolution of this idea then came in Episodes 4 and 5, when Keiji hijacked Mob's mind and forced him into a series of mind games curated by him to torture that very resentment and yearning for revenge that he had out of him, that Mob himself was worried that he had inside him. But through doing so, through being exposed to all of this torture and resentment and hatred, and with some help from a friend, he realized that he isn't the person Keiji or even he thought he was. He is strong, and the last thing he's going to do is run. And even in episodes 6 and 7, when this evolution in the character became even more apparent and pushed Reagan away, eventually both of them reconciled after growing as people. And now, in the final stretch towards the finish, we've witnessed Mob's evolution. How his fears took hold of him and demonstrated how he overcame each and every one of them, becoming a fine and kind young man in the process, and now standing as the antithesis to what Toichiro represents, a physical, psychopathic representation of Mob's greatest personal worry of who he
looks
might
so
become. The
good.
stage is set for a clash between two opposing ideals. For just like how Mob has spent his entire life hiding his powers and trying to develop himself beyond that, Toichiro has done precisely the opposite by spending the last 20 years of his life charging psychic energy for one expressed purpose: to take over the entire world, to destroy the lives of billions. In Mob's eyes, he himself is specifically not better than anyone due to his powers, whereas for Toichiro, he thinks himself better specifically because of his powers. He says as much. And so now, leaving all his support system behind, Mob marches towards a terrifying confrontation. A confrontation with what he feared he might one day become, and while doing so insists that his friends and allies would be in the way. He sounds like a true leader here, thinking of the damage that can be done, willing to shoulder all of this alone. However, Reagan won't let that happen and instructs Dimple to follow closely behind in his stead, while Sho fights his father. I mean, I don't even think that's really the correct way to describe
He
it. but, I mean,
tries.
like, we're shown that he basically
You
gets
know.
his face pushed in by his father. Anyway,
Yeah.
aside from that, we're shown
He
something
has a
I
go.
honestly wasn't expecting, but it truthfully made these final episodes all the more juicy thematically speaking. Serizawa versus Mob. Interestingly, this fight presented Mob with another less evil but still immeasurably destructive and harmful version of who he could have potentially been one day. A shut-in, isolated from society and far too anxious to ever engage with them properly. Due to this, he felt shunned by that very society and became easily led by the first silver-tongued manipulator willing to take a risk on him. One whose intentions were sinister, with one really sweet touch being at the very end of that engagement, when the counter soars to 100%, one that we've seen all too many times in this series, to drive home just how similar they are, the numbers don't represent Mob, but in fact, Serizawa's inner turmoil. With Mob choosing to absorb his attack and all the emotion that comes with it, gaining greater understanding and in turn send some of himself back to Serizawa so he too can understand that Mob truly understands him. This is beautiful, but
It's
once
great.
again, Mob manages to overcome an enemy without actually attacking them. And in that brief moment too, Mob demonstrates that he has the same abilities as Toichiro, to absorb others' powers. And we've seen it really with the Teru fight in Season 1 too. He has this ability, he always has. So it's a really nice touch to see that this is something that they also have in common. But unlike Toichiro, another difference between them is that Mob doesn't really have any interest in abusing this ability.
No, he never does. And yeah, he's always tried to keep it secret. He's not one for... Well, he's in the bloody fitness club, you know? It's like, he doesn't believe it to be the be-all, end-all.
However, upon demonstrating this technique to Toichiro by lending energy to his beaten child, Toichiro launches into battle with Mob and acknowledges him as an enemy, kicking Dimple to Reigen below in the process, spurring him to act.
動くな弾は入ってるぞ
There's a wonderfully classic and compelling set of back and forths between Reigen and Toichiro, very reminiscent of the climax to the very first season we all loved, with Reigen delivering perhaps the best comeback to Toichiro I think he could have ever said in that moment, saying, "If you ask me, you can only see powers that can't be seen, and so I feel sorry for you." That's just the right amount of blame mixed
Damn.
with compassion in there for it to be the perfect Reigen quip. However, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, this isn't the same scenario as Season 1's finale, and we are reminded quite quickly of...
Oh, yeah.
Because of Mob's actions, because he spoke to and reached Serizawa not as a psychic weapon, but as a human being
Yep.
with aspirations, fears, and feelings, Serizawa, through Mob's gentle counsel, came to his senses quickly enough to come to Reigen's rescue at the last moment. What a wonderful scene, and what incredible character writing. Toichiro, as a result, starts to fire indiscriminately into the city, bellowing that he has no one he can trust. He's a total psychopath, and so it's time to rage. This is where
Let's
the final battle of the
go.
series begins, and man, is it everything I hoped it would be, and more. Mob creates an arena where he can go all out, and in doing so, with Toichiro forcing more and more power out of him, Mob starts to laugh, and for the first time in the series, it's unsettling. The sort of laugh one might get out of having lived in a world made of paper their entire lives, now finally able to cut loose without concern. He's just like Toichiro. He's becoming a monster just like him. It's come to my attention after finishing this spectacular season that there's a noticeable amount of criticism launched at this very fight scene, calling it underwhelming visually or emotionally even. And while I can in some ways put myself into the frame of mind of someone that would agree with that, I quite literally could not think of a more
Disagree.
fitting
Yeah,
villain and
man.
action sequence to play out before them than what we ended up being served here and now. Okay, well, that's almost true. I do have one hypothetically vague criticism question mark, but before I get there, I want to outline exactly why I loved this final stretch between the big bad and Mob. I love that this isn't a fight of good versus evil. It's a fight of hope versus the hopeless, optimism versus pessimism, altruism versus ego. I drew comparisons to what Mob's character offered mechanically in Season 1 that was similar to Gohan's character in Dragon Ball Z. And I'm glad I shared that comparison because while they do share that aspect of their character in common, the point of these characters and why they are the way that they are could not be more different. In Dragon Ball, there's a powerful sense of catharsis with Gohan's character, with he needing to learn to control his power and become responsible with it. However, during the series, mechanically, these rage boosts were moments of release for the audience to bask in and enjoy. This is
Yes.
decidedly not true with Mob. The point of Mob's story is specifically not to use his abilities unless absolutely
Necessary, yeah, yeah.
And when he does lose himself to those darker tendencies that lurk within him, it's framed as a failing in his character, or a slip of judgment, or some horrible circumstance. At no point are we ever happy to see that happen to Mob. We might be excited in the moment, but narratively, it's seen as him losing rather than winning or embracing a side of himself. There's a scene where Mob genuinely cuts loose for a few moments and starts to sadistically laugh to himself. This is the moment I think a lot of folks were perhaps waiting for, but instead of embracing it, he felt let down by himself and reset. That, to me, is far more powerful than any rage moment that they could have conjured up in that scene.
Oh, yeah.
With him lamenting instead what he's forced to do. screaming to him, "You might not believe me, but I really do not want to hurt you."
Yeah.
He even says sorry while throwing a city, skyscrapers and all, at Toichiro to stop him. And on the topic of Toichiro Suzuki, I just want to say I think his design is rather well thought through. All of the other members of Claw have very distinctive designs and quirks, designed specifically to be striking. Serizawa with his hair and umbrella, Minagishi with his hair and weirdness, Shibata and his roid rage, and even Shimazaki, who is the most normal looking but still has the quirk of his blindness. However, the boss of the entire organization is so very plain. The only identifying
Yeah,
traits
there's
are
nothing
given
really
are
that
his
stands out
eyebrows,
about
and
him.
even then, those are probably only there really for the sake of clarity. Everything else about the design looks so mundane, measured, unremarkable. And to me, that only serves to reinforce further the similarities between him and Mob. Neither look too impressive and could easily be lost in a crowd. Visually, I love the story that this series is telling with his character and the elements that they're choosing to share between him and Mob. But Toichiro, as a character, is far too powerful to be taken down so easily, so passively. He cannot be restrained. And that creates the natural issue and dilemma for Mob to try and solve. He has so far defeated his opponents with his words and outlook on life, but now he's
Talk
met
no
with what
juice.
is or could have been effectively himself from an alternate reality, who is not focused on his own personal growth and development. Mob says, "I'm not strong enough. I don't have the power to show you a new path." And because he is so strong, because he is so lost in his vision of what reality is, Mob has to fight him.
Body improvement.
Oh, and what a fight! Man, in this moment, I fucking cried. Cried because he's doing exactly what brings him so much pain. Cried because he's desperately trying to prove that even if someone like Toichiro can be so far gone, he too can be saved. And I cried because those exact words are the mantra from some of the most supportive folks in his entire life. Friends that represent that part of Mob that's most valuable, the part that's human. Much like the climax of Season 1, this final fight here is not really about who is stronger. It is a battle of emotion, conviction, and worldviews. And the further into the fight we go, the more the music reflects that. While the beginning of the fight had plenty of rad fight music, by the end of it, though we are still watching the characters exchange legendary climactic blows, we are treated to more emotionally grounded music. With the final fight track, which is actually the theme labeled "Feelings Are the Source of Power,"
Oh.
Mob versus Toichiro
Cool.
is one of emotion and conviction rather than raw action and adrenaline. I think if I was to offer any tangible criticism towards this climax, it would be this, and really it's a nitpick at best. Like I said before, I wouldn't change any element of this encounter, but more so rearrange certain things that could perhaps create a more effective and cathartic conclusion. The way I see it, and I spoke with friends about this arc and season seem to have two monumental moments that ring to the core of the series as conclusions. And interestingly, they were placed far apart from each other, perhaps by design. Reagan's reconciliation and honesty with Mob in episode 7, and of course, the season's climax in episode 13. Both of these moments are spectacular, but for very different reasons, and to tell you the truth, I kind of see why they split them up. One is very much dependent on Reagan, and the other is very much the case with Mob more so. However, I do feel that if one somehow managed to combine these two moments in some meaningful way, it could have offered an emotional gut punch and cathartic bond the likes of which I've never seen before. But as it stands, 7 for me was the climax to the heart of the series, and episode 13 the climax to the inner conflict within Mob and the broader world. Both offer great experiences, and perhaps it works better this way, but normally writers tend to have the climax for their story occur at the end together to maximize the effect it has, and I'd be interested to see what that version of the series might look like if Reagan and Mob's reconciliation was saved for the climax of this fight. But, like I said, I think what they have here is an easy 9 out of 10, maybe even a 10 out of 10 if I don't want to be an asshole about it. Plus, it's not like I wasn't reduced to tears while watching this anyway. And with Toichiro saying things like, "I'm the protagonist of this world," and Mob saying, "I'm the protagonist of my own life," I think having philosophical outlooks duking it out without a more cluttered narrative in the
It's very
background
cool.
was probably a more fulfilling and focused idea in the end that one made. In the end, Mob stays with Toichiro, sits in his barrier with him, underneath all of his guards, and he won't let him suffer alone. Ready to shield the world from the blast that's brought about by the delusions of one madman, can Mob reach him before he meets an end molded by his own greed. In this moment, Mob, by absorbing his power, quite literally absorbs the trauma and pain from his life, showing in that moment the utility of the bonds that connect people to others. We share pain, We share the hurt we've experienced, that in this moment, Mob is trying to do everything he can to save Toichiro from himself. I can't think of a better way to end this. And this might sound like a tangent here, but The Last Airbender's final season, the climax to that entire series, I always had some issues with. But what Mob Psycho 100 has offered here is possibly the perfect way that series should have ended, and it instead does it itself here perfectly. There's nothing more that I can really say about this climax. I was just left speechless. It's perfect.
It's brilliant.
And everything that unfolds
So
after
freaking
is
good.
just that. Perfect. Serizawa feeling like he has a new lease on life, now working for Reagan under the supervision and tutelage of Mob, with a close-up of his hands fidgeting to deal with anxiety being one of the sweetest things I've ever seen.
And mate, it works so well in season 3. Oh, yes.
God, I love this character, and I've only known him for like an episode and a half. This lost toy has found a home that will love him finally, with this final parting moment from the beautiful season leaving me teary-eyed once again. There's one season of this incredible show left, season 3. I have no idea what they have left to talk about, and I can't wait to see what's in store for me there when I do see it. But until then, I've been Totally Not Mark, and thank you all so much for watching.
Oh, I can't wait to see his review of season 3, man. Oh my god. These reviews have been great. Ugh. Right, so oof. Yeah, man. What a season. There was bits I forgot about, and yeah, it's nice to have that. Season 3 is quite fresh in my head, so that review is going to be really, really cool to see. Because, yeah, like even Giggle said, it's like, you feel like it's done, but then when you watch season 3 and you're like, no, this was necessary, this was needed. And, yeah, can't wait to see it. That's going to be class. And until then, thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, link in the description to the Patreon page. $1 /support channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you guys very much for that. Thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave comments down below. Let me know that I should watch this in future videos. I'll see you guys next time.